Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Taylor. My guest today is Gretta Perlmutter. Gretta is a resiliency coach, speaker, and the creator and host of the podcast Coping with Ghosting. Gretta's personal story is a powerful one that started at the age of 12. Gretta is a resiliency coach, speaker, and the creator and host of the podcast Coping with Ghosting. Gretta's personal story is a powerful one that started at the age of 12 when she first experienced the pain of being ghosted by friends and significant others. This early heartbreak led her on a transformative journey, turning these experiences into opportunities for growth. Diving deep into the emotional landscape of ghosting, Gretta offers others ways to cope with the ghosting pandemic. Through her podcast, social media channels, as well as her group sessions and coaching, Gretta shares her proven methods for moving through the aftermath of being ghosted. We're excited to have Gretta with us today as we discuss ghosting and coping with loss and heartbreak. Gretta, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me here.
It's really nice to have you. I'd like us to jump right in and allow our listeners to understand maybe a little bit more about you, your experience with ghosting, and this whole inspiration that you have that's led to a number of things, providing great information on your website, as well as a podcast, Coping with Ghosting. Tell us a little bit more about your experience in the moment that you began to realize, hey, I want to help others around this same kind of construct here.
Absolutely. So I'm an extrovert and I love connecting with people. And I've had so many incredible relationships throughout my life. For example, my childhood best friend and I have been friends since we were 2 years old.
Wow.
And unfortunately, I've also had friends who have ghosted me. I've had work relationships, people who have ghosted me. And in dating, I've had people who have ghosted me. So it's the whole spectrum for me, really. And I honestly believe that's because I do connect with so many people that statistically, some of them just have to be ghosts. I was first ghosted when I was 12 years old. I was ghosted by a guy that I really liked. I also was ghosted in high school. That was pretty shocking. It was by one of my friends at the time who just one day she just completely ignored me. And that was it. I went up to her, I asked her a question about something, and she turned around and walked away like I didn't exist. And that was really hard. I was ghosted by a man that I was dating after college. And those earlier experiences were with ghosting took a tremendous toll on my heart. It was really, really challenging for me. And I didn't have the healthiest reactions to those experiences. I blamed myself and I thought, of course, I did something wrong in this relationship. Why else would they have treated me like this? So that was really challenging for me. And I also, self-soothed with lots of ice cream and alcohol and binge watching Netflix. So I didn't have the best reactions to all of that. In 2019, years later, I was using dating apps and I was ghosted by a handful of men. And I was horrified by their flaky behavior. But when I talked to my friends about it, they all related. Everybody I knew had been ghosted at some point. And even though it was their behavior, it had nothing to do with me. This was all early stage dating. It was still really frustrating. It felt hurtful, but I still wasn't bothered as much as I had been in the past by other people's vanishing acts. And I realized the difference was that I had grown way more confident over the years. And in 2019, 2020, I had a therapeutic self-care toolbox to get through all the setbacks. So I felt called to help people who were like me when I was first ghosted, people who were processing the big emotions and feelings of abandonment that came along with being ghosted.
What you're raising, I really like is that, ghosting, we typically think, I'm going to have you define it here in just a moment for us, but
Sure.
just so we have a working definition. But basically it's, someone suddenly leaving without an explanation, withdrawing, like your friend did. You went up to ask a question in, elementary school or middle school, and she turns around and walks away, and we don't have a meaning. And when you think about it, as human beings, we are meaning making creatures. We need to have meaning. The way that our brain processes things, any event, it goes into the emotional part of our brain first, and then it goes to the meaning part of our brain second, and then we can file it away. But if we don't have meaning or can't create understanding, then it flips back to the emotional part of our brain, and it stays kind of locked up in a, hamster wheel kind of set of emotions. That's kind of what trauma is when you look at it. And so the absence of understanding really can be very, very challenging and painful. But what you're raising is a good reminder that it can happen with anybody, friends, dating, coworkers, others. It's not specific just to dating, is it?
No, it can happen in any walk of life where there is a personal relationship.
Well,
It's pretty tough.
I think the cool news you're talking about too, there are some friendships, and you talk about the friendship you had with a friend from 2 years old. I got a friendship with a guy from first grade, and we still have it, and
Yeah.
it's a pretty special thing to have that. And I think in life, there are certain relationships that we can probably put them into three categories. Sometimes, we have a relationship with somebody for a reason. Maybe it's where we're work colleagues and we're working on a project. Maybe it's a season where we're in high school together, or
Mhm.
maybe if we're lucky, it's for life. And so we have different categories of friends, and not every friend carries over into subsequent categories. And so there's a certain level of maturity and understanding that can come from that. And we just, hey, that was a great season we had together. Remember that? Or that reason we worked on that project. Boy, that was really great. Or man, I've kept you as a lifelong friend. That's a whole nother level. And then the way we cope with it, like you said, it's very easy to kind of personalize it. If we could, let's go back real quick and let's talk about this idea of defining ghosting first, and help us just get a foundational kind of cornerstone meaning of what that
Right.
is.
Right. So this is actually a relatively new word. It was
Hmm.
introduced into the Collins English Dictionary in 2015. And I use the definition from the Oxford Dictionary, which is the practice of ending a personal relationship with someone by suddenly and without explanation withdrawing from all communication.
Hmm.
And what's
Yeah.
important to note is that this is very different than leaving an abusive situation without a goodbye, because that's called self protection. And it's also different from disappearing after a boundary has been violated, that self respect.
You bet. Yeah, I think that's a great distinction. Sometimes you have to slip out the back, in an abusive relationship. That is not ghosting. That is self-care, like you said, self-protection and self-value. And you can't have goodbyes in abusive relationships because the other person just cannot tolerate that piece. And so it becomes controlling and about power and all the things we know. So I appreciate the definition around that. It's a relatively new term, but it's been happening, for a long time. But we got a term now to kind of hold it together. What makes it so easy nowadays to be ghosted or to ghost another person?
Yeah, it's really all about digital communication.
Yeah.
So it's so easy to just block somebody's phone number, to unfollow them or
Mhm.
delete them as a friend on Facebook or block them. It's just you can cut all ties. Also, I do want to bring up that during the pandemic, many people formed a lot of online relationships. I
Mhm.
have coaching clients that were ghosted by somebody they had an online, like, exclusively online relationship, who they
Mm.
never even met in person, and they built up this big, in their mind, deep connection to this
That's
person
right.
who they never met, and yet then that person vanishes from the app or blocks their phone number, and then boom, they're completely gone.
That's a good reminder. During the pandemic and given the isolation that we were kind of mandated to do, we were so dependent upon the online connection. And you're right when you suggest that we likely idealized some connections more than they were really real. We didn't right size really what they were because you don't know somebody in their whole context. You see somebody online and what they look like, and
Right.
there's a kind of a unidimensional understanding of them rather than a broad understanding of who they really are. But we form nonetheless kind of a connection and almost kind of an attachment in
Mhm.
almost in an idealized way. And when that is not there or is taken away or ghosted, that's a pretty big loss. What are some of the
Yeah.
feelings just in general that you find those that you work with really struggle with? The feelings around and attached to being ghosted.
So it's extremely painful. Perceived rejection triggers the same neural pathways in the brain as physical pain.
Hmm.
And this is also an ambiguous loss. So this person, we know they're alive, but
Yeah.
they're not emotionally available to us. They're not present. And this is one of the hardest things that we can experience in terms of relationship. When I was first ghosted by a man that I was dating, I honestly thought he died.
Mm.
I Googled his name to look for his obituary because
Wow.
I was so confused because we had gone from seeing each other all the time and planning, like, he had just asked me on this big trip that was across a bunch of different states. And then all of a sudden he was gone.
Wow.
And I was just so confused by it that I just had to. So it's just this uncertainty, right? You can Google the answer to anything, but you can't find out what happened to your ghost, especially if they're alive and well and kicking. So, and especially if they don't have social media. So our brains don't like these open loops. It causes a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, we're wired for meaning and understanding and predictability and provides security, doesn't it? Yeah.
Exactly.
So these feelings you're
Um,
talking about, it can tag our self-worth. It can
yeah.
kick up a sense of, without meaning, unfortunately, when there's a blank space, hey, why did this happen? And we don't have an answer. Again, the way that our brain works, like you're suggesting, our neural pathways kind of go down to, well, if this event happens and I've got strong emotion like surprise and disbelief and kind of worry, maybe that
Yeah.
uncertainty leads to, I have to have some meaning to define this. Otherwise, we stay in
Yes.
that emotionally charged way, but we have to fill in the blank sometimes. And like you're
Yes.
suggesting here, we fill in the
Yes.
blank with usually, unfortunately, it must be about me.
Exactly. And I want to share that some of the things that I used to say to myself. So
Yeah.
it must be because I wasn't cool enough for him, or I wasn't pretty enough or good enough. And so what I realized is that my brain was saying I was ghosted because of this insecurity or that insecurity.
Mhm.
I was making this all about me. I was assuming what was going on. Meanwhile, a few months later, after I was ghosted, I discovered that the person who had ghosted me was engaged.
Mm.
So it really wasn't about me, and it was all about him. So some of the other emotions that I felt: anger, anxiety.
Yeah.
I felt like, oh, I don't think I can trust anyone anymore. I wallowed in self-pity. I had many sleepless nights. There was lots of rumination. It was
Yeah.
just the whole spectrum of problems after this. Like, it was incredibly painful for me, and it took me months and months and months to get over dating this person.
It must have been very hard. I can't imagine because you're planning some things, you're anticipating some things,
Yeah.
you're working under the presumption or the assumption that we're doing okay, and I can lean into this and lean on this,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden I lean on it and it's not there, and I fall, and I don't know why. What you raise is a really good point. Almost always, the first place we go is to. It must be something about ourselves, our self meaning. And
Mhm.
our self meaning usually taps into a deeper self meaning that we don't even understand at times at an unconscious level we hold about ourselves. And everybody has a self meaning that they're not aware of, whether it's something along the lines of maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe there's something, fundamentally wrong with me. Maybe I don't have value. Maybe I'm not that important. And that usually, almost always, has some remnants from our pasts, our earlier relationships, and
Mhm.
typically even in our families. And little do we know that it's
Mhm.
maybe even down there, but a time like this can really tap into that. And so we look to fill in the blank with, unfortunately, must be me. And we fill it in
Mhm.
with something deeper. And it very rarely is, or if it is about us, it's reasonable, but it's usually something else that's going on, but we always own it, don't we?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think we own it because then we feel like maybe, well, maybe there's something I can do. If I wasn't nice, maybe I can be nicer. If I wasn't cool enough, maybe I could be cooler. It gives us some sense of power to personalize it, but it's a paradoxical tendency that we have to I assign something that's not really even mine, and then it kind of tanks me sometimes. Like you said, it gets very, very hard. I like that word, ambiguous loss. It is an ambiguous loss, isn't it?
Absolutely. Dr. Pauline Boss wrote about it in her most recent book, Ambiguous Loss. I think it's called like Ambiguous Loss during the pandemic or something along those
Mm.
lines. But she kind of coined that term ambiguous loss, and she has a whole different way of analyzing that. But yeah, it's one of the hardest things that we can go through.
I think sometimes, when we talk about letting our children start to date and what's the right age to date, or let's say similar, like what's the right age to be able to start driving and being given the keys of the car. I don't think there's an age to it so much as what level of maturity do you have within yourself to go into this realm, because there's going to be some difficult times and you got to have kind of like you're describing, a solid foundation of who you are. If you're going to enter this realm, people are going to be kind of knuckleheaded sometimes, and they're going to do things because they may not understand their own psychology, but you've got to be kind of resilient. We're going to talk about that in a moment. You've got to be
Mhm.
resilient going in and recognizing that probably more times than not, if you're doing right things, the other person's still doing their stuff too. But there's a certain level of maturity required, isn't there, to put ourselves out there?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some of the reasons that you found people ghost others?
People ghost because they're either unable or unwilling to have a mature adult conversation to end a relationship.
Yeah.
And this could be because they don't want to have the uncomfortable conversation.
Hmm.
Maybe they just don't have the communication skills to know how to do it.
Hmm.
People pleasers may not want to hurt somebody's feelings by being
Right.
direct, right? It's also that people could do it to be vindictive, hurt people, hurt
Mm.
people. There was actually a study about this called Leaving Without a Word, Ghosting in the Dark Triad. And it suggested that people with dark triad traits like psychopathy,
Mm.
Machiavellianism, and narcissism tend to avoid the difficult conversations associated with ending a relationship whenever possible. So that's a whole thing, unfortunately. Like some
Mhm.
mean people ghost. Like my favorite quote, though, really is from a therapist. I would like to read it.
Yeah,
It's
please do.
Her name is Malia Koi, and she says, as a therapist, clients have admitted to ghosting as a protection when the relationship was going well. They felt terrified of a safe, secure, emotionally available partner. They ended the relationship abruptly because it was going well and
Mm.
feared showing someone they admired their vulnerable, insecure parts. Ghosting can be so harmful because those being ghosted often cling to the worst fears about themselves. And
Mhm.
in many cases, that's just not true. I find it quite harmful to try to understand the ghoster's motivation.
What stands out to you in that quote?
It could be anything. Assuming that you have been ghosted
Mhm.
because of something you did wrong
Mhm.
is incredibly unhelpful and potentially harmful.
Right.
This isn't about you. You didn't ask to be ghosted. You didn't choose to be ghosted. The ghost is responsible for their own, in this case, crummy behavior.
Yes.
It's their choice. And it's just really not helpful if you go down a rabbit hole with ideas of why you could have possibly been ghosted. I'll give another example of this. My friend thought she was ghosted by one of her good friends. And she was really upset with her friend. She had all feelings like, oh, what did I do wrong? It had been a month. Finally, her friend calls her and says, I'm so sorry. I was in rehab. They took my phone away. Like, I couldn't communicate with you. And yet she had this whole narrative in her head, this
Mm.
false story that was so wrong. That was all
Mm.
about her. And it's just completely unhelpful.
Well, like you said, though, earlier, we look to create meaning for the space that's filled secondary to the ghosting that's occurred. And, you just talked about something I want to kind of highlight. There's almost we could say a continuum for, those that can ghost. One would be those that are more narcissistic and Machiavellian and psychopathic. Those folks are just going through life looking for supply. They're the most
Hmm.
insecure folks possibly around, but they use people for their own good. Those that are more narcissistic, psychopathic, and kind of that way are like buckets with a hole in it. They're going around looking to have their bucket filled all the time, and nothing ever really fills them. So they go from person to person to person. Once they're filled, they leave, and that person and they're usually very charismatic. They're very usually, very extroverted, people oriented people naturally kind of sat up alongside them. And really feel kind of hopeful, and all of a sudden they're not there. And that's their whole MO. And they're just toxic people that we look, to avoid. On the other end of that pendulum would be what you just mentioned in that quote of someone who starts to experience the very things they've been wanting all of their life. Let's say some trust and some security and maybe some safe intimacy. And all of a sudden they kind of go, whoa, this is too much. Be careful what you ask for because you might get it. And now I've got to pull away because I don't know how to be in relationship with healthy. And so I preemptively pull away because at some level I'm getting anxious about how good this just may be and how I might have to trust some things in a new way. A number of reasons, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You're also raising another piece too that says if something happens, we're so at a tendency to say, oh, it's all about me. And our first step should just be to pause. And instead of saying, well, what did I do? It should be what's mine, what's yours, and what's ours. Did I do something? If I didn't, I'll own it. And if I can look at this and analyze it, and I see that I didn't do anything necessarily wrong, so I can't own this. And I wonder if we did anything together, something didn't click. Maybe it wasn't a good enough fit. Oh, okay. Or maybe it's not about us. Maybe it's not about me. Maybe it's just about you, the ghoster, that, maybe it's about you this time. So we don't, rather than kind of holding on to it and being the responsible part for it. When you talk about the responses, what are some good responses? Like right out of the gate, someone doesn't get, a text for a while or a phone call back or someone's not showing up. What are some good responses initially to being ghosted?
That is such a good question. And it is highly debated on social media.
Mm,
And this is actually a pretty tricky gray area. For example, if you felt like you had a toxic relationship with a ghost, like they
mhm.
fell into those dark triad trait categories,
Yes.
maybe they called you names or they put you down. I wouldn't recommend reaching out to them at all. I would just focus on myself and try to my best to move on because that just is not somebody I would want in my life, and I wouldn't
Good point.
recommend that to anyone listening.
That's that
But
self-care you talked about earlier. That was a good
yeah.
that's a good suggestion. Yes.
Mhm. Also, for any listeners, if you're unclear if the relationship you are in is unhealthy or was unhealthy, it's a good
Mm,
time to seek counsel, like a therapist or coach or counselor for that, just to really to evaluate if this is something you want to do. And I also offer a free guide. I co-wrote it with Erin from Atlantic Mediation,
mhm,
and it's copy and paste text that you can send to your ghost. And this guide is great. It's at copingwithghosting.com. It walks you through exactly what to say from if you think you're being ghosted and you're not sure to if you're certain that somebody is ignoring you. So just so you know, in the guide, I have a lot of disclaimers. Like, first, don't reach out if you're not going to be okay if they don't respond, right?
mhm,
Like, reach out from a place of no matter what, if they respond or not, I'm going to feel fine. Also, in general, I always suggest that people use their voice, call out ghosting behavior if that's something that they feel comfortable doing.
mhm,
One of the things I say is you can copy and paste this text if your ghost hasn't, responded in a month or so. And it's just that I'm extremely disappointed that I haven't heard from you. I'm not sure if you're going through something right now or don't know what to say, but that does not give you the excuse to ghost me.
mhm,
You're better than this. You're capable of kind communication. I deserve more. My time is valuable. So
mm,
I'm moving on. Take care.
mm. Very good. Yeah. I know on your site you have a drop-down box that has a couple of things on there, coping with ghosting guide, also 6 texts to send to your ghost. And thank you. I think you just read one of them right there. That's pretty cool. I like that response. What you're talking about there is in these moments, it feels like something's been taken away from us, or we're trying to make some sense of some things. And we kind of lose our balance in a way, emotionally and otherwise. And what you're talking about is how do you regain control? And how do you reclaim your value when no one's there because of the ghosting to kind of mirror that to you the way they might have been while the relationship was going on? You've got to mirror yourself and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not okay. And I'm going to give them a chance and maybe offer something, but I'm also going to reclaim my own value and worth. in the process. Say just a little bit more about that part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I always say take the love that you wish your ghost would have given you and shine it all right back at yourself. This is
Mhm.
your opportunity for extreme self-care, right?
Yeah.
This is a new beginning for you, and it
Yeah.
really is frustrating, and I get it. This is again like complete heart-shattering stuff.
Yeah.
But now is the time for you to focus on what brings you joy
Mhm.
and to do things that light you up
Yeah.
and to live your best life. So that's just a little tip of the iceberg of what I
Yeah.
share in my Take Your Power Back workshop.
No, I think it's good. I mean, in any part of a relationship, including, the early dating parts, the way that we conduct ourselves in these times, if the relationship works out, ideally is what we're going to be doing throughout the relationship. Let's say, someone ghosts us in the dating process. Well, that can kind of happen in relationships too. We get together with somebody, we commit, we're, doing life together. And sometimes ghosting looks like avoidance. They
Mhm.
pull back, they shut down, they kind of, ice you out, those kinds of things, and not okay. So if we learn ourselves how to manage these things early in our lives or early in a dating relationship, these are still skills that we come back to later and we say, "Hey, babe, I feel you pulling away, and I don't want to disconnect with you right now. What's going on?" And so we practice the very things you're talking about. You're also suggesting, there's different kinds of control, aren't there? There's the external locus of control, and there's an internal locus of control. And external locus of control means that I'm okay if we're okay, and I'm okay if you're okay. And if you're not okay, I can't be okay. And if we're not okay, then I can't be okay. So I'm looking for things externally to make sure that I'm okay on the inside. And what you're talking about here is shifting more to an internal locus of control so that we are mirroring ourselves in healthy ways and trying to hold something up to the other person. What kind of role, Greta, do you find maybe others being able to provide during this time? Maybe whether it's a parent, maybe friends. What does the best support look like from others around us? Maybe if we're going through a ghosting period.
Yeah. So it's important to surround yourself with people who care about you
Yeah.
and people who are empathetic to what's going on because a lot of people don't understand this. A lot of
Mhm.
people have told me, "Oh, just get over it, just move on."
I know, not okay. Yeah,
And yeah, so you definitely want to be talking to somebody who's
yeah,
like, "Wow, I can see you're in a lot of pain right now. How can I best support you?" And recognize that this isn't just about erasing it from your mind
right.
or
Yes,
putting it in a backpack and throwing it away, right? Like this is
yes,
this is a lot to process. So for this, just for listeners, if you did want, you can join my free and private Coping with Ghosting Facebook group
yes,
where you can share your story, even anonymously if you wish, with there's 1,000 people there right now, and we've all been ghosted. And I moderate everything, so it feels like a really, one of those safer spaces on the
yes,
internet.
yeah.
And it's all just about supporting people who have been ghosted. So that's another option.
That's a great option. I like the 2 sides you're giving right there. One side is, hey, here's some ways that you can look to others and surround yourself during this time to help kind of buoy you up and to kind of spot you through a difficult time. Your site being one of them. I also like you're kind of giving some tips to those that could be supports around someone who has been ghosted. Basically, when someone of value to us gets ghosted or hurt, just in general, but ghosted particularly here, we get angry at that person and we want to say, just drop them, or just, toss them out.
Mhm.
They weren't worth you and all those things. And
Yeah.
that's not where to start. What you're saying instead is, what if you start with, man, that must be really hard. And, tell me what you're
Mhm.
feeling here. Tell me, connecting with that emotional bridge first, staying experience
Mhm.
near, and then just kind of holding them in that space and then kind of walking through, what are you thinking about doing? And how can I be a support to you? I always like that question. How can I be of best support to you during
Yeah.
this time, like you're suggesting?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
And when you're with a coach or your therapist, another way to that could be really helpful to move forward is to write a letter to your ghost
Hmm,
and not to send it, but read it to somebody. Just get everything you want to say on that letter. Put your rage down on that page, read it out loud, read it. You could do this alone too if you feel comfortable doing so. And then
Yeah.
just rip it up, tear it to shreds. That has really helped me. That also
Yeah.
got rid of some of the nightmares that I had after I was ghosted as well.
That's nice. Yeah. The page of rage. I like that. And then just kind of deal with that, burn that, cut that up and let it go. That's good. Hey, we're kind of turning the corner here in our time. And
Mm.
we started today with your being very honest and very open and transparent about your experience. Is there another story that comes to mind just as we wind down today of someone, who was ghosted, or maybe something else you want to share about yourself? And what did it look like? And what from that experience might have been something that someone got to experience kind of in a transcendent way to grow from this and not be
Okay.
defined by it?
Okay, so I had a friend of 15 years who ghosted me. This
Mm,
was after I started coping with ghosting, and it was pretty shocking. Of
mm,
course, my ego was bruised, but at the same time, I knew she was in a really tough place in her life. And I also knew that if there was anyone in the world who could get through this in a healthy way, it would be me,
mm,
coping with ghosting podcast host. So I knew that I could grow around my grief.
mm,
And I talked about it. I talked about what happened with my friends, my family, and I allowed myself to cry. Right.
mm.
I moved through those really intense waves of grief.
Good.
I practiced self-compassion.
Mm,
I didn't beat myself up for it. I didn't blame myself on her decision not to be my friend anymore.
mhm.
I just kind of took it one day at a time. And also, I just want to say, I did forgive her. I chose to forgive her. And now, forgiveness is a choice. You don't obviously have to forgive anyone. A lot of mental health professionals consider ghosting to be abusive.
Yes.
And I'm not here to say forgive somebody who abused you. It's really personal. You have to honor where you're at. It doesn't mean that you're going to forget what happened or that what they did was okay. But when I forgave my friend, I felt a tremendous sense of peace and freedom. And I did
Mhm.
it for myself. I knew that I forgave her when I could think about her and feel zero resentment. And
Nice.
honestly, I want the best for her now.
I really like that part there, Greta. I think that's you talk, and sometimes when we go through things like this, it's a little bit like Kubler-Ross's stages of death and dying. It's
Mhm.
thematically a death, where we kind of, the first stage is kind of surprise and, bewilderment and this can't be real. And then the second stage is often maybe kind of a bargaining. Well, did I do something? And what can we do here? And how can we fix this? And then we kind of we kind of recognize that things aren't changing. We get kind of angry at times, and then we might get a little depressed, or vice versa, depressed and angry. And then we get to a place maybe where we can accept it, and ideally we can transcend it and grow from it. And I think forgiveness that you're raising here is a really helpful and healthy piece to the
Mhm.
healing process, because forgiveness is for me, not you. You're the one that was a knucklehead, and you're the one that left me. And I have a right to be angry at you, but I'm choosing not to, because if I hold that, I'm emotionally tethered to you. And
Mhm.
I don't want to be tethered to you. I don't want to be only okay as I feel towards you. And I want to be able to forgive you for my sake and to let you go in the same way you're talking about right there. For you, it moved to a place where you can genuinely say, I wish her the best. That is significant. Nice job on
Mhm.
that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, hey, you know what? I would love, as we wind down for today, our listeners to learn more about you, to be able to follow up with you, your blog, your podcast. How can our listeners follow up with you after our show today?
Absolutely. I invite you to listen to the Coping with Ghosting podcast, which is on Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify, it's pretty much on all the podcast players. And you can also visit www.copingwithghosting.com, where I have a lot of the resources we discussed today, including my Take Your Power Back workshop, and it includes links to my podcast. So that's another way find me. Yeah, and I'm also on Instagram at Coping with Ghosting, the Facebook group. Again, just search up coping with ghosting on Facebook and you'll find us. And I'd love for you to join that too.
Really nice. Well, I sure appreciate what you're doing. You're helping people with their sense of self, with their hearts, with their identity, and helping kind of restore a real kind of solid ego, a healthy ego in who they are, to go out into the world and to take the risks that come in any kind of a form, with a coworker, someone we might date, to friendships that requires risk. And you're providing people with some hope that holding your own value is going to be a real central piece to this. And like you said earlier, sometimes people we come into a relationship, little do we know, but they're hurt too. And like you said, hurt people unintentionally and sometimes intentionally, but a lot of times not. And we get to create meaning for ourselves based in our own self-worth. So I really appreciate what you're doing, what you're offering our listeners and those out there going through some heartbreak times, maybe related to ghosting. So it's been great to have you on the show today. Thank you, Greta, so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure.
I also want to thank you, our listeners, for dropping by and joining Greta and me today. It's always great to have you with us. Regarding our episode today, I want to remind you that it and its resources and all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. Thanks again for being with us. And we'll look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Tribe Network, all rights reserved.